Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Minisode of Abolition is for Everybody, the one where we talk about universal voting rights. For those who don't know, Minisodes are much shorter, a little less polished, but are still super friendly and still all about abolition. My name is Graham, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Nicole Porter. Welcome, Nicole. We're so excited to have you. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Graham. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Nicole Porter. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy for the Sentencing Project, which is a research and advocacy organization based in DC that works on a range of issues related to challenging mass incarceration, including ending felony disenfranchisement and expanding the vote to everyone, including those in prison.
Oh, that's amazing. So I'm previously incarcerated. I also, under Prop 17, I was able to get my voting rights back. I got to work on the campaign to pass Prop 17 immediately upon being released from prison, and then get my voting rights back subsequently from that passing. So I understand the impact directly. A question I have is, are there states that actually let folks that are in prison vote? And if so, where?
Sure. There are two states where people never lose the right to vote, and it's never been a part of the voting rights laws in those states. So Maine and Vermont allow people sentenced to prison who had a residency prior to their imprisonment in the state continue to vote or register to vote while in prison. And two territories, so Puerto Rico has allowed people to vote while in prison, sentenced to prison since the 80s. And Washington, D.C., where I live, expanded the vote to people sentenced to prison in 2020. So about 2,000 people from Washington, D.C., who are sentenced to prison are now eligible to vote while incarcerated, while sentenced to prison.
That's amazing. If I think of California, just the landscape, the political landscape of California, and I think how tough of a push it would be to make that happen in California. Now, we've got previously incarcerated folks their voting rights back, but that was a push. And so to get people in prison that right back seems almost insurmountable. It's a worthwhile task, though. So what are some steps that we could do in California to make that happen?
Well, I think there's an active movement working to expand the franchise to people in prison across the country. And I know in California, there's been longstanding interest to do this, but Proposition 17 was one way to move the conversation forward. And with that and the number of people who voted in support of that, and now with folks like yourself who are able to vote because of it, I think building upon the reform and the win from Proposition 17 a couple of years ago, continuing with the organizing and getting the word out in California that ending felony disenfranchisement, expanding to universal voting rights for everyone, including those sentenced to prison, regardless of their crime of conviction. There's just something to continue to build on and build towards, and to know that work is happening in the context of a national movement. So going into 2023, there will be active campaigns working to expand the franchise to people in prison. Hopefully, we might even get a win this year. There's active effort in Illinois that's pending in the state assembly there that will be called up after the midterm election in November. So fingers crossed, with a lot of organizing led by a state group there, felony disenfranchisement will end in Illinois and people will be allowed to vote who are sentenced to prison. And then building off of that win in 23, there will be legislative campaigns in states like Oregon, Connecticut, and New Jersey. And I think the effort to expand the franchise to people in prison in California can know that work is happening in the context of a national movement. Obviously, in California, just following in the footsteps of Proposition 17, it would have to be done by ballot measure. But you have the number of people who voted in support of Proposition 17 a few years ago. There are national organizations who are motivated to support a future ballot initiative in California around universal voting rights or guaranteeing the right to vote for all. So knowing that there's national partnership around that, and that with the wins in DC in 20, hopefully the win in Illinois this year, and then the expansion of the franchise in other states, that when California is ready to build on a ballot measure, that there's going to be people around the country who are willing to support and willing to come to California, willing to be led by Initiate Justice and some of the other California groups who are leading on the ballot measure to make sure that it happens.
You make it sound really doable. I appreciate everything you just said. So folks often think that people who come from marginalized communities don't care about politics and voting. And we know that's not the case, that it's just that they face a lot of barriers in access and otherwise. So what would you say to those people?
Well, In my experience, that's certainly not the case. I've been invited into several prisons in my, over the years while working at the Sentencing Project. In fact, I just went in to a prison in Maine in mid-September when the Secretary of State went into the Maine State Prison in Warren, Maine, about 90 minutes outside of Portland. And the Secretary of State went in with her staff to register eligible voters at the Maine State Prison. And during that conversation, we talked about politics. Obviously, people were registering to vote. It was a meeting, a conversation around voter engagement, civic engagement. So the Secretary of State started talking about the need to address and guarantee ballot access for eligible voters in Maine State Prison. We talked about the history of voter suppression in the United States, the long through line of white supremacy in the United States. These are words coming from the Secretary of State now. And the elected, she's not elected in Maine. She's the appointed Secretary of State in Maine, talking in the state prison where people sentenced to life were in the room, people with shorter terms of imprisonment were in the room. But the whole goal of the conversation was around voter registration and then guaranteeing ballot access for people who were registered. And the Maine Secretary of State led this conversation along with community leaders from the prison around the need to vote, the need to participate in the franchise. And so we know that there are conversations happening like that in prisons throughout the country. In fact, several formerly incarcerated colleagues talked about, have shared with me and shared in conversation in community town halls around their ongoing political engagement and political education while incarcerated, and how that's been, a very important influence in their lives. And so we know that those conversations happen, behind the walls, and that some of our incarcerated colleagues are leading these campaigns in a number of efforts in a number of states across the country. So I hope it's not a surprise to the folks listening to this conversation. And then it's what sort of continues to drive our work and influence our participation and support of these conversations, because we know these discussions, these political conversations, this interest in political engagement are happening behind the walls in every state across the country.
Absolutely. I was thinking back while you were talking. So I was incarcerated during the last 4 years of my sentence at correctional training facility. And I just happened to be there as Initiate Justice was picking up traction. And I was watching folks. Now it's a common misconception based on like media misrepresentation or otherwise that folks inside aren't thinking about stuff like that. But I watched as bills began picking up traction and whole segments of the community inside would get behind these bills and go cell to cell and talk to people about it. People were donating off their books to push measures along. It was really amazing to watch and be a part. I mean, I didn't engage necessarily while I was in there. I was engaging in other like self-help work, but watching it pick up traction is what got me involved out here. So I really appreciate the message that you just gave about, folks inside and the misrepresentation of how politically involved they are. There's a huge like soulful addition. I don't really know how else to word that, but like it felt like it added to my soul to be a part of the process, even if I don't necessarily believe in the process. And I know from words from other folks and otherwise that they felt the same. So yeah, I really appreciate everything you just said. So I have a question. This is for the viewers because it seems almost pointless to ask because I know why it's important, but I'll ask, why is it important for us to vote?
Well, it may seem obvious to ask, but it's such a fundamental question because every year people choose not to, right? They get busy. Maybe they can't take the time to vote. So making a choice to vote, to participate in the franchise is important. And it's a decision that has to happen every electoral cycle. Hopefully people aren't just doing it when there's a presidential race and, there's somebody really exciting on the ballot. But even in the between elections, when the local races or the down ballot races may not be drawing a great deal of national attention, but they can impact the school board, or they can impact who is elected sheriff and who runs the local jail, or who's the elected district attorney, and whose policies influence charging decisions, and what kind of cases are regularly brought and before the courts. So there's so many reasons, including to be an active part of the community, to be an active member engaging in civic life, contributing your perspective, your vote, your political perspective to who ultimately will be charged with governing you, right? And then to continue that engagement even after the person is elected and installed in office, takes the oath of office, to continue to engage that elected official, from the sheriff to the district attorney to your city council person to your state assembly person or state senator to the governor, to a whole range of elected officials, because you, as their constituent, can hold them accountable to the policies that they run on, that they purport to support, and to guarantee that they're living up to their promise and they're living up to the spirit of whatever statements they make during campaign season. So there's so many reasons to continue to participate in the franchise, to vote, and to continue to engage long after election day. In addition to the benefits for the community, there's some exciting research. The Sentencing Project is a research and advocacy organization. So there's some exciting research that we're working to look into around what are the pro-social factors that can contribute to somebody being fully a part of their community after their criminal legal system involvement. And voting is certainly amongst those pro-social factors, including obviously living wage employment, quality affordable housing, community connection from the family members to being fully engaged in a community, and voting and participating in civic life is an example of that. So these are factors, including voting as a factor that can continue to involve somebody who's been historically marginalized for a range of reasons, including people who have former criminal legal system involvement, into the community, so that they are fully embraced by it rather than being marginalized from it.
Absolutely. I love that. I'm thinking about just the feeling prior to getting involved with the work that I get a chance to do now. The feeling that everything was just happening to me and I had no control, I think is designed to appear that way. And the first time that I had a chance to go with Initiate Justice up to the California Capitol in Sacramento and do a walkthrough and watch things happen and talk to some of the legislators, like I felt like this is something that we can actually impact, but it can't just be me or the two people next to me. It has to be an entire community of people. But that feeling of the shift, like the realignment of my thinking in terms of like life is happening to me, this political system is happening to me, to I can do something to change that, was fundamental in me, living a life outside, like being outside. I've been home for 4 years now, and that's a key component of my success, if you will, in reintegration into society.
I think that's a lesson that so many people can benefit from hearing, and then also considering in terms of the context of their own lives, not just people who are formerly incarcerated or criminal, have criminal legal system experience, but having a purpose and thinking about that broader purpose in terms of your relationship to the community is something that so many people think about and is a part of so many people's life journeys that can help give purpose, connect people to a broader community for so many. And it's important for so many reasons, not just as a measure or as a factor to help, reduce the likelihood of returning to prison for somebody who's formerly incarcerated, but for any neighbor, for any member of the
Yes.
community who might be looking for some further way to be involved, to give full meaning or greater meaning to their life. So that civic engagement, that voter participation are things that many people can look to, and are lessons that many people can learn from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to ask about the national report that you're working on publishing. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the report we published last week, it's called Locked Out 2022. And it found that 4.6 million people nationally are disenfranchised from voting, will be disenfranchised from voting during next week's midterm election. The number has gone down since the previous report was published in 2020, but there's still millions of people who are disenfranchised from voting. Since 2020, obviously, in California, Proposition 17 was passed. So now the last category of residents who are disenfranchised in California are those in prison. Hopefully, we'll build a foundation and we can work towards next steps towards a ballot measure to end felony disenfranchisement outright in California, expanding the franchise to those sentenced to prison, regardless of their crime of conviction. And then the report also worked to document other changes since 2020 that help explain that modest decline. And yet still the report highlights the fact that there are too many people disenfranchised from voting because of the felony disenfranchising laws that vary from state to state. So there's 4.6 million nationally. The state with the largest number of disenfranchised voters are folks in Florida, despite the ballot measure that was adopted there several years ago. But the narrowing of that ballot measure with the requirement around fines and fees obligation, because the ballot measure restored voting rights to people who completed their sentence. There were carve-outs in that ballot measure, so people convicted of homicide and sex offenses did not get their right to vote back automatically following the completion of their sentence. Those folks still have to seek pardons from the governor, from the clemency board and the governor. And then the legislature defined what it meant to complete a sentence in 2019 by requiring fines and fees payments as a part of what it meant to complete a sentence. So that's a cautionary tale to learn, because as you and the audience may have seen, in August, about 20 people were arrested who unknowingly, they disclosed while being arrested that they did not know that they could not register to vote. Many of them registered after officials, not, Florida officials, either at the Department of Motor Vehicles, local election boards officials. They came in contact with nonpartisan Florida officials around voting who mistakenly encouraged these people to register to vote. And they did so, and then were arrested as a part of the governor's election integrity prosecution unit. Since their arrest in August, at least one person has had their case dropped. And in fact, because many of these people who've been charged with this voter fraud, who are justice impacted, unknowingly register and vote, have been prosecuted, not just in Florida, but also in Tennessee and Texas. Many of these cases actually end up getting dropped. There's been some outrageous cases from Tennessee and Texas over the years. One of the folks who was arrested and charged in Florida has had their case dismissed already, and I imagine that other cases will be dismissed. So despite the media attention that these arrests and initial charges draw, many of these cases many people do not end up being convicted and sentenced to these voter fraud offenses. So these are outrageous political stunts that are undertaken by political ideologues who are working to suppress votes rather than support the expansion of the franchise. And it's a cautionary tale. And it explains, well, in spite of 2018 ballot reform in Florida, there continue to be over 1 million people who are disenfranchised from voting. So I say all that to say that there have been reforms. In fact, we've documented that since 1997, about 25 states and Washington, D.C. have expanded the franchise. And of course, California is included amongst those states, that there are still millions of people who are disenfranchised because of how difficult states make it to register to vote and participate in the franchise, even after reforms have been adopted. And Florida is a cautionary tale around that.
That's tragic. I'm thinking, like, the media representation, how many people would be discouraged from seeing that happen, so they wouldn't register to vote. I'm also thinking about in California, some stories I've heard from folks that are incarcerated right now in the county jail. So they still have their rights. They aren't in state prison, so they still have their voting rights. But most folks, even with the efforts of groups like ACLU going into the jails and trying, are met with amazingly difficult obstacles through the sheriffs and other departments in getting material to people to vote, to be informed about what they're voting for, and getting the ballots out. That's very disheartening. But I mean, just continue to work, right? Just continue to work at it and chip away.
It's even in theory, well, not in theory, the law in California even allows people who might be incarcerated on a probation sentence, right? Because you could be incarcerated because of a violation, a probation violation, and a parole violation, technical violation, not a new crime, but parole violation or probation violation, and in criminal custody. And the law in California should guarantee ballot access for those individuals as well. I think what you're speaking to and what needs to happen is that the state should guarantee access to the ballot for people who are in custody and eligible to vote. and make it as easy as possible, given the lack of infrastructure that makes that happen. So that means, first of all, if there are government officials who do not know the law, the state needs to do better around educating those people around what the law is, so that they are not misinforming incarcerated voters of their constitutional right to participate in the franchise. And secondly, the infrastructure needs to be put in place to lower barriers to voting. That means, ballot boxes and supporting, active absentee ballot programs, but also means bringing a polling location to the facility,
that's smart.
whether it be a
That's
jail or some other correctional facility where people who are on probation or parole and eligible to vote can participate in the franchise too. Making it as easy as possible. The barriers to participating in the franchise should be completely eliminated. And that is something to actively work towards to the extent possible. And there's so much more that has to be done, because the reality is that even in the general population, voter participation is very low. And in midterm elections, voter participation is very low, even in the general population. But at the very least, in correctional facilities where people are legally eligible to vote, voter participation and voter registrations can at least mirror what the outcomes are in the general population. And about nationally, 60% of people, of eligible voters, participate in elections each cycle. And so that is one marker to strive for within any correctional facility throughout California where residents are eligible to vote, is 60%, match it 60%, if not exceed that rate.
Absolutely.
In Cook County, during the March primary this year, 27% of incarcerated voters in the Cook County jail, where Chicago is, voted, and that exceeded the voter participation in the general population during the March primary, where only 20% in the general population of Cook County voted. So 27% voted from the jail, 20% voted in the general population, and mirroring those kinds of outcomes in counties throughout California is one thing that coalitions and officials could work towards.
Absolutely. We have some work moving forward. That sounds like admirable work. So I want to ask before we go, thank you so much for everything that you said. I want to ask, what did we miss, just for the viewers? Anything that you want the viewers to know?
Just that the viewers, know that there's a movement, know that I'm excited about the possibility in California and the energy coming from initiate justice building off of the Proposition 17 win. And I know the continued work that's happening to lay the foundation for a future ballot measure to end felony disenfranchisement outright and expand the franchise to those inside. And know that that work is happening in the context of a national conversation where similar dynamics are playing out in other parts of the country. There are groups who want to support ballot measures. And so as Initiate Justice and your partners work to develop next steps, feel free to be in touch, and we can make sure to support the coalition and the movement that's happening in California in this way.